His research interests include cannabis, phytochemical optimization for specific disease states as the concept of phytochemical synergy within the cannabis genus, known as the entourage effect. His talk today will introduce a little cannabis history of use, present recent evidence focusing on the many concerns around cannabis use medically, and the focus on introducing the endocannabinoid system, an entire neuromodulatory system that we would know nothing about if it was not for research into the cannabis genus. So please welcome Mr. Justin Sinclair to the podium.
All right, everything's working. Thank you, and thank you for the kind introduction, John, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So much to cover this morning, so I'm going to jump straight in, and I'm sure as many of you around the room have as much as I've seen quite a lot of human tragedy, helplessness, and misery in the last 3 years in my charity work around medicinal cannabis, both here and in the USA, to pretty much last me a lifetime. So as such, the interesting thing is that I cannot express to you the impact that many of these patients that have been requiring medicinal cannabis have had on me or us at the UIC team, nor the effects that the plant has had on them. So I speak in the past tense, of course, as if this journey is now over, but regrettably we don't seem to be there quite yet. With the speed and ease of patient access evolving and the education programs now becoming a focus and priority for the patient advocates, pharmacists, politicians, and medical practitioners in Australia today. More encouraging, however, is the discovery of the endocannabinoid system, which represents what I believe is one of the greatest scientific findings in the last 50 years and could assist us in identifying new treatments for previously unmanaged diseases, as well as assisting us in understanding more about disease etiology and pathogenesis. And I sincerely hope to try and demonstrate some of these and several examples of this in my talk today. So here is what we're going to try and get through. This morning, our talk starts out with just a brief introduction into how we got here, how we're having this discussion at a symposium once again, and then we'll move into some of the commonly held myths and potential risks, of course, surrounding this plant, which are obviously weighing heavy on many minds. After hopefully then lulling you into a false sense of security, I'll unleash upon you the science detailing the physiology and anatomy behind the endocannabinoid system, which, as John mentioned, we'd know nothing about if it wasn't for research in the cannabis genus at all. So still woefully absent from modern anatomy and physiology textbooks, we'll briefly explore this ECS, its anatomy, physiological roles, explore dysfunctional presentations from the current scientific literature, and finish off with touching on some of the clinical challenges, of course, that face the use of cannabis for medicos in Australia today. So it's really just a taster of what is quite a complex system. So without further ado, let's get started. So many ethnobotanists and academics basically believe that, of course, cannabis has been used for about 10 millennia, but it's hard to obtain or difficult to obtain proof regarding this and calculate its exactly, because it's probably likely, as it says up there, from research by Beta-myrcene, that it predated human writing. So cannabis is believed, as you can see on the map there, to have originated in Central Asia, with nomadic peoples first coming across it when they entered its home range. So in geographical locations, interestingly, where cannabis was not grown or used as a psychotropic, this is where it was cultivated just for its bast fiber. So suggesting different species and subspecies dispersal at an early time in human evolution. So this specific knowledge and growth of more THC, tetrahydrocannabinol-rich strains seem to have originated in the Himalayan region around modern-day Afghanistan, whereby it was disseminated to India, China, Asia Minor, and also Africa, and was likely, obviously, a valuable trade commodity. Now, according to solid archaeological evidence, however, cannabis has been used in China since the Neolithic period around 4000 BC. It was first written about by the Emperor Shen Nung in his Compendium of Medicinal Herbs around 2700 BC, and similar evidence has been found in the written histories of India in the Atharva Veda of 1500 BC and the Sushruta Samhita of 800 to 500 BC. Confirmation of the therapeutic use of cannabis genus also exists in Persia, around 600 BC, when it was written in the Zendavesta. So too in Egypt, from the written evidence encoded within the stone of the pyramid texts from Memphis in 2350 BC, and later in the papyrus Rasmesum III of 1800 BC, the Hurst papyrus of 1550, the Ebers papyrus of 1550 BC, and the Berlin papyrus of 1300. So in more recent history, though, cannabis was brought to the UK, of course, by that Irish physician O'Shaughnessy in 1839, after observing its use as an effective appetite stimulant, antiemetic, muscle relaxant, anticonvulsant, and analgesic in India. And it is, as it said, even Queen Victoria allegedly being dispensed the plant for period pain. So its use continued spreading, and by 1854 it was included in the United States dispensary and was sold freely in most Western countries, still being available in most for more than 80 years after this time. So how did we get here, having to hold symposiums campaigning for the reintroduction of a herbal medicine which was used in this country as a medicine less than 70 years ago? Well, here's one of the men responsible for it. So in perhaps one of the greatest examples of propaganda engineering in recent history, Harry Anslinger is largely credited for the lies and falsehoods for which cannabis is still tarred to this day, hand-selecting the best of bigotry, racism, and religious fear in the strokes of pens and testimonies to Congress. He abolished and made illegal the use of a plant that's been serving mankind for millennia, which was opposed at the time by the American Medical Association. It said that he bullied and coerced many in the medical profession to support his claims, and a pharmacologist, Dr. James Munch, an expert witness of Anslinger and professor of physiology and pharmacology at Temple University in Philadelphia, actually testifying under oath, and I quote, that after 2 puffs on a marijuana cigarette, I was turned into a bat. I mean, it seems legit to me. However, I would love to get a sample of what he was smoking and analyze it. So having read through this slide, I'm sure you can agree it's truly horrifying. I mean, who in their right mind would consider jazz or swing satanic music? Now, I don't know about you, but speaking for myself, I've partaken in far more acts of violence under the influence of alcohol than anything else. In fact, I dare say the limit of violence that most people have experienced under the influence of cannabis extends largely to smashing a whole pizza and then destroying half a tub of Sara Lee ice cream over the course of about an hour. I mean, when was the last time you heard of a rampaging group of cannabis-smoking football hooligans? I mean, I rest my case. But let's now have a brief look at some of the wonders that Anslinger actually released into the general public during his tenure in drug enforcement. They would be hilarious if they were not so effective. So here, for the 1930s Christian and Catholic majority in the United States, such posters immediately struck terror into the hearts of parents everywhere. I particularly like the reference to it being used as a pill on the right, and lots of references to hell, the devil, and sin. For any God-fearing American, this was basically a mandate from on high, as to use cannabis would therefore cast doubts on one's faith. This was step one in a very effective fear-driven campaign to control the masses. And considering that at the time, of all the representative political assembly in the United States, only one was a noted atheist, the rest being largely conservative Christians and Catholics, it was a way to control policy as well. But this is just the start. Where things get really interesting is coming up now. So these are perhaps my favorites from the collection of Anslinger's fantasy. On the right here, we see some more positive reinforcement of the devil and religious overtones, so it's at least good to see some continuity in the message. I also particularly enjoy the term sex orgies. I know I don't get out much these days, but I must admit I'm at a loss to decipher what other types of orgies actually exist, and welcome my esteemed audience to please enlighten me should I be overlooking something glaringly obvious. But the next one is just pure gold. I mean, after all this time learning about cannabis, here we are educated about the use via needle of this herb. I was shocked to learn that millions worldwide has been doing it wrong all of this time, and am sure it has nothing to do at all with trying to connect its use to the more harmful illicit drugs like heroin. So this, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is why such prejudice still exists for this herbal medicine and still exists in the training programs of medical professionals to this day. Like I said before, it would be humorous if it wasn't so successful. And as Winston Churchill once said, a lie gets halfway around the world before truth has even had a chance to get its pants on. So with this being said, let's have a look at what state of dress we find some of the evidence in regards to some of the risks associated with cannabis usage. So before we get started looking at many of these associated risks, let's understand that most of the cannabis risks have been identified from illicit use and abuse, okay? Utilizing cultivars that are not necessarily focused on having any therapeutic or medicinal effect, focusing more on recreational use. So some of the concerns obviously raised by many, particularly in the medicinal and political communities, are coming forward, but we'll start out with IQ. So it's long been touted that cannabis can reduce human IQ because it kills neurons. So whilst consumption of certain varieties of cannabis that have been indeed bred to have high levels of THC may indeed cause a decreased function in short-term memory, these changes are not considered permanent and resolve with cessation. So more interestingly, however, as you can see on the slide, is that compounds within cannabis have actually been found to be neuroprotective. In vitro and animal studies are demonstrating that certain cannabinoids in cannabis, such as CBD or cannabidiol, may reduce damage to the brain caused by a lack of blood flow or oxygen, and also assist in preventing the neurological degeneration seen in conditions such as multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's disease. THC, or delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the psychoactive component associated with cannabis, was shown to stimulate the removal of intraneural beta-amyloid and also reduce inflammation, which was published in June 2016 in Nature and Aging and Mechanisms of Disease. So whilst more research certainly needs to be done in human trials, the preliminary results are certainly encouraging, and I look forward to the leading world expert in this area, Dr. Girdman, enlightening us about this topic of neuroprotection after I finish waffling on. So, and what of the significance of twin studies? This is obviously very important for any of you in the scientific community. Recently, a review of 2 longitudinal twin studies conducted by Jackson and colleagues and published in the Proceedings for the National Academy of Sciences in 2016 found that cannabis using twins failed to show significantly greater IQ decline relative to their abstinent siblings, which is therefore suggestive that observed declines in IQ are attributable more so to familial or other factors. What about all cannabis gets you high? This is another good one. So compounds such as THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, generally attributed with the psychoactive effect of making the user feel high or stoned. So narrow-leaf drug varieties rich in CBD and lower in THC are incredibly useful medicines that don't necessarily cause this feeling because it is based on dose, which is why many prefer to actually use non-psychoactive strains during the day and assist in managing their condition, not feeling too affected, and then THC-rich strains at night time to help deal with pain and sleep. So it's actually this level of phytochemical individualization and phytochemical selectivity in specific strains or cultivars that's one of the greatest strengths of cannabis as a medicine. So does this mean, I hear all the time, that THC is a potentially negative constituent then? And the answer is, of course, certainly not. If I hear one more person suggest that CBD is medicinal cannabis and THC-rich strains are recreational, I may well burst a vessel. So THC is the main constituent involved in the pain-relieving, sedative, and muscle-relaxing activities within cannabis, amongst numerous other pharmacological actions. And as you know, certain pharmaceutical drugs, such as the opiate and benzo classes, don't exactly leave you feeling normal either, so this dose-dependent psychoactive activity should not be a precluding or prejudicial factor either. So what about the risk of cannabis causing lung cancer? This was an interesting study by Hushabay. So in this population-based controlled study conducted in 2006, it demonstrated that heavy cannabis users have an equal or lower rate of lung and respiratory tract cancers than non-users, even though cannabis smoke has been proven to contain cancer-causing products of combustion. So how can this be, I hear you think, and I'm glad you asked. So it's likely that many of the phytochemicals within cannabis have been, or actually have quite strong anti-cancer compounds or properties, which has actually been known for quite some time. So here you've got this paper from Munson and colleagues in 1975 showing that phytocannabinoids like delta-9 THC, delta-8 THC, and cannabinol actually retarded Lewis lung adenocarcinoma growth and also increased mean survival time. This being said, and in the interest of balance, it's only in vitro evidence, but it is encouraging in these cell lines and will hopefully promote more meaningful research in human clinical trials in the not-too-distant future. And Dr. Donald Tashkin at UCLA has actually led research in this field in lung cancer for decades, and he cannot find any direct association. He He actually published a paper in the American Thoracic Journals in 2013 suggesting that the accumulated weight of evidence implies far lower risk for pulmonary complications, including other pulmonary diseases such as emphysema, or even heavy use of cannabis compared with pulmonary consequences of tobacco. Long-term chronic cannabis use can increase the risk of chronic bronchitis, however, due to epithelial cell loss and impairment of the alveolar macrophages, but this usually subsides with cessation of use. So while smoking cannabis can still need to be studied more to determine in absolute terms that it doesn't cause lung cancer, it can certainly still irritate the respiratory tract, especially in sensitive individuals. Most patients, however, are turning to non-combustible delivery forms, such as vaporizers. These vaporizers allow users to inhale just the medical cannabinoid and terpene components without any combustion taking place and being present in the vapor. Whereas infused oils and other oral extracts are also safe, efficacious, and convenient, and although do exhibit different pharmacokinetic properties to inhaled forms. One thing of importance that is incredibly important to highlight here is this discussion in Australia, this kind of weird cult that we have of putting tobacco with cannabis for smoking. So this has its own, obviously, potential problems, considering tobacco's proven carcinogenic qualities, and could actually skew results and potentially increase risk. So if there are any clinicians in the audience today and you are seeing patients that are using cannabis for medicinal purposes and smoking it, this is definitely an important line of questioning for a harm minimization. So what about topic of cannabis causing dependence? This is one of my favorites, long and being highly addictive. So there's been a lot of conflicting evidence, and again, remembering that a lot of this evidence has been based around strains specific to the recreational groups, if you will. But after reviewing sample sizes, this was one paper that I found by Anthony Warner and Kessler in '94, surveyed over 8,000 people in the USA between the ages of 15 and 54 on illicit drug usage. And it was designed to assess patterns of dependence. Now, I realize that this study was conducted over 20 years ago, but I believe this represents what's known as a seminal study in this field and is adequately powered sample size to produce some meaningful results. So of particular interest is that cannabis can indeed cause dependency, as you see here, but let's have a look at things a bit more closely. 24% of the study respondents with a history of dependence, or 1 in 4, reported being dependent to tobacco, whilst 14%, or 1 in 7, reported dependence to alcohol as classified by the DSM. Now, worthy of note here, looking at these statistics, is that it's around 4 to 4.6% for cannabis, which is 6 times less than that of tobacco. Now, many other factors need to be considered here, of course, such as individual variability of the patient and why the cannabis was being taken or utilized. For example, if someone's suffering from chronic intractable pain and is non-responsive to other medical or pharmaceutical treatment, it's reasonable to assume that they would be dependent on cannabis for pain-relieving activity on a daily basis. We also need to consider that as an illicit substance, cannabis is also the cheapest to obtain in comparison to substances like cocaine and heroin. Now, in this study from the UK with the graphics and references available on the MCRA website, you can clearly see that cannabis is very low down on the dependency list. Coffee, which is now not placed on the scale, comes in at 0.9, which is higher than cannabis at 0.8. Yet cannabis's legal and deadly cousins, alcohol and tobacco, are both far higher up this scale of dependence. So I always find it funny that these statistics are conveniently overlooked by government scientific evaluation committees when it comes to the discussions around cannabis dependency. So this obviously then migrates and leads us to the next question: does cannabis cause people to go to use harder drugs, or the gateway theory? And the evidence here is quite compelling. So the idea of cannabis being a gateway drug is not new and has been touted for quite some time, but there is conflicting evidence in the scientific literature. In California, a state that's legalized medicinal cannabis dispensaries, patients can access medicinal cannabis with a card from their authorized healthcare provider. A study conducted in California in 2008 on 350 registered medicinal cannabis users found that cannabis may actually serve as an exit drug and not a gateway drug. So let's have a look at these figures. 40% of the respondents reported using cannabis as a substitute for alcohol, 26% used it as a substitute for other illicit drugs, and 66% used it as a substitution for prescription medications. Further findings also suggested that 65% of patients use medicinal cannabis due to the propensity for less side effects, 34% due to less withdrawal effects, and 57% felt that it provided better symptom management for their specific medical condition. Now, in the interest of balance, I understand that this is a small study, but it does propose a counter-argument against the traditional viewpoint. And whilst on this topic, new evidence has been shown that medicinal cannabis use is actually associated with a decrease in pharmaceutical opioid deaths. The CDC in the USA posted in 2010 that over 16,000 people died from pharmaceutical opioid analgesics, which equates to roughly 45 people per day, and that opioid overdoses have quadrupled from 2000 to 2014. Now, in Australia, the rise of addiction to prescription opiates has been particularly noteworthy and devastating. From 2002 to 2009, the amount of oxycodone prescribed in Australia increased by 180%. Furthermore, in the late 1990s, hospitalizations due to opioid poisoning were predominantly related to heroin, but by 2008, prescription opioids accounted for over 80% of opioid-related hospitalizations. Now, I also read this interesting paper just the other day by Mahuri and colleagues, published in 2013, with data from 2002 to 2012 showing that the incidence of heroin initiation was 19 times higher among those who reported prior non-medical opioid pain reliever use than those that did not. Whereas a study by Lankenau in 2012 suggests that the young urban injection drug users interviewed between 2008 and 2009 found that 86% had been using opioid pain relievers non-medically prior to using heroin. So I'd imagine that based on such statistics that it's a far greater public health concern that the outdated science around cannabis being a gateway drug. But what about some uniquely Australian statistics? Here you can see up the top some numbers of overall deaths from pharmaceuticals, illegal drugs and alcohol from the years 2009 to 2015. An alarming upward trend is pretty easy to see. Now, the second table shows statistics of overdose deaths for just the opioids and the benzodiazepine classes. So it's easy to see that thousands of Australians have overdosed on prescription medications. And the really concerning thing is that these are just Victorian statistics. Okay? So in this regard, cannabis is coming to the rescue based on new evidence in just the last couple of years. So Barkhuber and colleagues published a paper in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2014, clearly demonstrated that state medicinal cannabis laws in the USA are associated with a significantly lower state-level opioid overdose mortality rate, which lowered in year 1 by 20% and strengthened to 33% after 6 years, with a mean average of about 25. So such evidence supports the findings presented in the Ryman statistics that also, cannabis may well be an exit drug. Furthermore, and perhaps more interestingly, is that medicinal cannabis may also show huge cost savings to the public healthcare system. In this study by Bradford and Bradford in 2016, it was shown that between 2010 and 2013, US states with medicinal use of cannabis were shown to have a 12% lower rate of pain relief prescriptions in the US Medicaid patients over 65 years of age, and between 8 to 13% lower rates of prescription meds for anxiety, depression, nausea, psychosis, and sleep disorders. So national overall reductions in the Medicare program when states implemented medicinal cannabis were estimated to be approximately $165 million per year, a not unsubstantial amount of money. So maybe it is a gateway drug after all to huge cost savings within our overburdened healthcare system. And again, if you want to learn more about this, I'm sure we could probably coerce Professor Simon Eckermann, who'd be happy to talk about this on his talk on Sunday. So another study supporting this was published this year in the Journal of Psychopharmacology and showed that 76% of respondents that regularly used opiates reduced their use when taking medicinal cannabis, with approximately 71% reducing anxiolytic medication, 66% reducing migraine medication, and 65% reducing sleep-inducing sedative medications when utilizing this herbal medicine as part of their treatment plan. Now, this is an important topic and is probably the most quoted when it comes to cannabis that I hear from politicians and particularly medical professionals. As you know, psychosis can be both a symptom by itself or a feature of mental illness. So it's characterized by being unable to distinguish what is real or losing contact with reality. So the causes of psychosis are not fully understood, but involve a complex interplay of individual genetics, physical, environment, and psychological factors. Cannabis is perhaps more concerned in heavy use with younger people that are still developing neurologically. So there have been a large amount of articles proposing cannabis can cause psychosis and schizophrenia, and of course it's a likely trigger in certain individuals. However, a review article here published in 2016 by Sir and Hart, it was proposed that the evidence reviewed from these previous studies suggests that cannabis does not in itself cause a psychosis disorder. Rather, the evidence led the researchers to conclude that both early use and heavy use of cannabis are more likely in individuals with a vulnerability to psychosis. So more research certainly needs to be conducted in this area to fully understand this relationship, and we must also consider the quality or variety of the cannabis that's being consumed, whilst only until very recently, as we said, has been quite high in THC. Furthermore, in this UK study by Hickman and colleagues, it was estimated that to prevent one case of schizophrenia, approximately 2,000 young men would need to stop using cannabis. So putting some perspective on the discussion. Or perhaps more importantly of all, is that despite cannabis use increasing in many jurisdictions internationally and around the world in ever-increasing numbers since the 1960s, statistics on schizophrenia prevalence have been stable at 1%, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, and are certainly not growing at a rate proportional to increased uptake and availability. Now, can cannabis use be harmful? And I think the science is quite clear around many constituents in cannabis, so that we see that based on these changes to mental perception, even though most of these studies and statistics were done on social or recreational use, the increased risk of harm, of course, still exists. But we also need a healthy dose of perspective here. Data obtained from the Australian government's Quit line has suggested that 50 Australians die each day from a tobacco-related disease. That's about 1 every 28 minutes. In 1998 alone, there were 19,000 deaths attributable to tobacco, and in 95, 3.2 million adult Australians were identified as being at risk of developing chronic health conditions because of tobacco smoking. Now, the impact also on alcohol is not that much better. So when we look there, it's about 5,500 deaths in 2010 alone, with an additional 157,000 hospitalizations. One drug responsible for 157,000 hospitalizations. When we start to take that into account, not only the human suffering and cost, but the cost to our tax-paying system, our healthcare system, is quite staggering. So can cannabis cause potential harm? We know it can, and the answer is yes. But comparing currently available statistics of the cannabis using risk, causing harm to the statistics we've just looked at for alcohol, tobacco, and also the medicines that I posed previously, the opiates and the benzo classes, well, as I've said before, and even though it is rather vulgar, I'll repeat it again, but it is like comparing a fart to a cyclone. Now, cannabis, again on this topic of being harmful, just how toxic is cannabis from a toxicity point of view? So generally, to determine toxicity, we look at the LD50, something that many of you would have heard of and be comfortable with. So this is defined as the dose required to kill half the members of a population after a predetermined time frame. Essentially, the lower the number, the increased the toxicity. So this being said, what I want you to understand here is that THC and CBD are in their purified forms, which is obviously not how they appear in their phytochemical profile of a whole plant, and therefore not very accurate representation of how dangerous cannabis is. So the therapeutic ratio to effective dose over lethal dose of cannabis is said to be between 1 to greater than 20,000. So just how much whole plant cannabis would you need to actually cause death? And so I started to dig through the literature to see what I could find. So the Centers of Disease Control in the USA suggests they have not recorded any deaths attributable to purely cannabis in their data sets. And the National Cancer Institute suggests that because there are no cannabinoid receptors in the brainstem, it's highly unlikely that overdose is possible. But I did find a 1988 Department of Justice or Drug Enforcement Agency brief written by Judge Francis L. Young after expert consultation on the matter, and at which he read out, and I quote, "In layman terms, this means that in order to induce death, a marijuana smoker would have to consume 20 to 40,000 times as much marijuana as is contained in one cigarette. NIDA-supplied marijuana cigarettes weigh approximately 0.9 grams, so therefore a smoker would theoretically have to consume nearly 1,500 pounds of marijuana within about 15 minutes to induce a lethal response. And what does that look like, I hear you ask? You have 15 minutes. Your time starts now. All I can say is good luck. Okay, so how about brief interlude, some audience participation. With a show of hands, how many of you support the use of cannabis for medical conditions in Australia? And that's about what we're seeing in the statistics. About 85 to 91% of Australians support this. How many of you support the legalization of cannabis for social or recreational or spiritual use by adults? Okay, so the numbers dropped a little bit, but that's okay, still there. Now here's the crunching question. How many of you have cannabinoids in your system right now? Most of your hands should be up, shouldn't you? Because this is actually going to start to kick in our next section, which is the endocannabinoid system. We wouldn't have the endocannabinoid system if we didn't have or produce them. So, of course, all of us do. And then phytocannabinoids from plants, synthetic cannabinoids from pharmaceuticals interact with this system. And so this is what we're going to talk about now. So the evolutionary development of the endocannabinoid system has taken place over millions of years and across diverse biological organisms, with evidence of cannabinoid receptor genes being found in the deuterostomian invertebrate Siona intestinalis, the sea squirt, suggesting that these receptors have been developed in this class about 500 million years ago. So further investigation has uncovered that cannabinoid receptors are also distributed widely throughout the vertebrates and have been documented in fish, amphibians, sea urchins, mollusks, leeches, and mammals. So you'll also notice on this slide that the ECS is not covered in current medical or health science curriculums by the majority of Australian education providers. So to any of you from academia today, please do your best to see this very important aspect of homeostasis and balance included so that this can lay the foundations for new minds to tackle the important research questions associated with such a broad-ranging and influential neuromodulatory system. Now, research into how the phytochemicals in cannabis interact with human physiology was also a slow evolution, taking place in a coordinated fashion for many decades. This academic investigation was largely impeded due to inconsistent cannabis plant samples, prohibitive laws hampering availability and research, and a poor understanding of the chemical structure of the plant cannabinoids. With advances in analytical separation techniques, Gaioni and Meshulam elucidated delta-9 THC in 1964, and 3 years later chemically synthesized THC, making it much more widely available to researchers. Almost 20 years later, in 1984, studies elucidated that cannabinoid agents inhibited cyclic AMP accumulation in neuronal cells via this receptor-mediated cellular response. And in 1988, Meshulam and colleagues demonstrated that THC was stereospecific and thus required a specific site of action for binding. Later that same year, the first cannabinoid receptor was identified by Devane, and 2 years later, structural expression was defined by one of his colleagues, Matsuda. Now, research interest started to grow internationally now, and by 1992, the next bit of the puzzle fell into place. That is, what endogenous ligands were manufactured by the organism to bind with these receptors, and this was discovered. So based on what researchers already knew about the phytocannabinoids and their highly lipophilic or fat-loving structure, researchers hypothesized that the endogenous ligands within us would also be lipid-derived. This was proven correct by Devane and colleagues once again and identified anandamide known chemically as N-arachidonyl ethanolamine. A year later, in 1993, the second cannabinoid receptor was isolated and was thought to mainly exist in the peripheral tissues, which has since been updated. And in 1995, one of the main endocannabinoids, 2-arachidonyl glycerol, or 2-AG, was discovered by Meshulam and Sugiura. Lastly, and not discussed on this slide, is the evolving research into the enzymes involved in the production and degradation of the endocannabinoids, which largely became a target of pharmaceutical interest in the late 1990s. As such, the endocannabinoid system represents a wide-ranging neuromodulatory system involved in the regulation of many facets of homeostasis, with cannabinoid receptors widely expressed in many cells and tissues throughout the body. Essentially, the ECS is comprised of 3 major components. Cannabinoid receptors, the CB1 and CB2, although others are posited, which are distributed throughout the various organs and tissues. The endogenous ligands, that is, the endocannabinoids that interact with those aforementioned receptors, and the enzymes that are involved with the synthesis and degradation of these ligands. Now, of key clinical interest here is that any individual variability or genetic polymorphic modifications to any of these 3 components can potentially modify the normal functioning of the entire endocannabinoid system and the body systems that it regulates, which invariably highlights the importance of taking a patient-centered approach to the use of cannabis and cannabinoid agents in patient care. Now, cannabinoid receptors belong to the G-protein coupled or GPCRs receptors and are expressed in abundance in the CNS, where it far exceeds those present for the neurotransmitters they modulate. Now, for those of you with a scientific background, let me repeat that. They are expressed in abundance in the CNS, where it far exceeds those present for the neurotransmitters they modulate. It's very significant, okay? So this is not all about the cannabinoid receptors, as you can see on this slide. With many different receptors obviously being expressed, so expressing endocannabinoid binding. So here you see the GPR55, GPR119, the transient receptor vanilloid or receptor potential vanilloid 1 receptors, which are very important for pain, and the peroxisome proliferator activated receptor alpha and gamma subtypes, the PPARs. So the more we're learning, the more we actually are finding that the ECS is a web through which most of our physiological responses are firmly enmeshed within. Now, being rather severely colorblind, I have it on good authority that purple is quite easy to see on this diagram, so please fill me in if it's not the case, so I can seek appropriate retribution. CB1 and CB2 receptors, coupled to the G proteins, demonstrate physiological activity by one of three ways. So the first one by inhibiting adenylate cyclase, that is, inhibiting the conversion of ATP to cyclic AMP and hence to cyclic AMP-dependent protein kinase. So this is very important because it feeds into the second point. Stimulating mitogen-activated protein kinases, which is directly involved in various cellular responses. So based on stimuli such as mitogens, osmotic stress, pro-inflammatory cytokines, and therefore assist in regulating various cellular functions such as gene expression, mitosis, apoptosis, and cellular differentiation. As such, stimulation of the MAPK is a direct mechanism which cannabinoids have been implied to impact synaptic plasticity and possible neural regeneration and growth. And then third, modulating the activity of potassium and calcium ion channels, assisting in transducing the binding of agonists. So the latter protein-mediated modulation of ion channels includes activating inwardly rectifying A-type potassium channels or inhibiting L, N, and PQ-type voltage-gated calcium channels, thus modulating neurotransmitter release with noradrenaline, acetylcholine, glutamate being examples. So the CB1 receptor is distributed extensively throughout the brain and the central nervous system. The high CB1 levels in the sensory and motor neurons are consistent with the important role of CB1 receptors in motivation and cognition. CB1 activation inhibits the neurotransmitter release of GABA, glutamate, dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, D-aspartate, and noradrenaline of both excitatory and inhibitory synapses. As such, CB1 receptors are primarily involved in the modulation of neurotransmitter release centrally, but also have roles in causing coronary and cerebral dilation, neuroprotective signaling, relief of pain, and even promoting neural stem cell differentiation. So CB1 receptors are the same receptors that delta-9 THC from cannabis bind to cause the various psychotropic and medicinal actions. For example, the amygdala is responsible for emotions such as fear and anxiety, and as such, in certain patients, THC can cause this as a side effect, particularly in varieties bred to have high levels of it. The cerebellum is involved with balance and motor coordination, and not surprisingly, THC can cause this to be impaired. The effect of THC on the hypothalamus is thought to be why it increases appetite. It may impair short-term memory due to acting on the hippocampus and alters pain sensitivity by working on the spinal cord, particularly the substantia gelatinosa. So of particular clinical interest is the sparse expression of CB1 receptors in the brainstem, specifically the cardiopulmonary centers, which explains the lack of respiratory depression with cannabis use, but which is commonly observed in opiate medication overdose. Interestingly, the anti-nausea effect of cannabis is believed to directly work on this particular brain structure. So the CB1 receptor is also present, but in much lower concentrations, in peripheral neurons and non-neural regions such as the vascular endothelium, testes, epithelial cells, several peripheral organs, and the eye. Now, the CB2 receptor expression is largely in the peripheral immune cells and tissues, and currently considered responsible for the effects cannabinoids have on immunomodulatory activity. So this is largely thought to be through the CB2 signaling pathway playing a critical role in regulating microglial activities within the central nervous system. So CB2 receptors do not cause any noted psychoactive activity, but do contribute to local analgesic effects. Furthermore, CB2 receptors demonstrate important neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory activities, with CB2 expression being enhanced by inflammation, which is suggestive that this receptor subtype is involved in the endogenous response to injury. Recent evidence has also demonstrated the role of CB2 activation in analgesia in acute and neuropathic models of pain. So next stop on this brief journey through the ECS is the ligands that interact with those receptors. So the term endocannabinoid merely represents our body's own endogenous products that interact with the cannabinoid receptors to elicit basically physiological response. And for the most part, two endocannabinoids have received basically the lion's share of this research, that being anandamide and 2-arachidonyl glycerol. So anandamide was the first endocannabinoid isolated in 1992, and it was so named after the Sanskrit word ananda, meaning supreme joy or bliss, due to its cannabidimetic activity pertaining to anandamide's ability to interact with our cannabinoid receptors and mimic that same psychotropic effect of THC from the plant. So as you can see, several other endocannabinoid-like compounds have been identified and are still undergoing research into their exact roles within the body. So here's an example of the enzymatic synthesis and degradation of anandamide. Once again, I apologize for the garish colors used, but it's all that I can actually differentiate. A non-color challenge friend once described this particular diagram as an affront to the Lord himself, hence my previous apology. But the catabolism or hydrolysis of anandamide is primarily mediated by the enzyme fatty acid amide hydrolase, which degrades anandamide to arachidonic acid and ethanolamine. Alternatively, anandamide can be oxidized by certain cytochrome P450 enzymes, lipoxygenases, and even cyclooxygenase 2. The diverse and complex enzymatic mechanisms involved in the endocannabinoid metabolism are important in maintaining what we call the resting tone of this entire neuromodulatory system. That this diversity also highlights that the inherent abundance or deficiency of these enzymes in the individual can have a dramatic influence over the ECS functioning. As such, if the enzymes responsible for endocannabinoid degradation were suppressed experimentally, a prolonged therapeutic activity of the endocannabinoids is achieved, demonstrating another promising target for cannabinoid pharmacotherapy. So 2-AG appears to be the true ligand for the cannabinoid receptors rather than anandamide, and is the key endocannabinoid involved in retrograde signaling within the brain. So 2-AG can be produced by several different metabolic pathways also, showing its importance. And current research suggests that 2-AG is far more abundant in the central nervous system than its partner anandamide. Now here you can see the catabolism of 2-AG mimics that of anandamide via oxidative processes, via also the cytochrome P450 enzymes, lipoxygenases, and cyclooxygenase 2. However, obviously the specific enzymes involved in synthesis and degradation are different, with monoacyl glycerol lipase or MAGL and the membrane-associated alpha and beta hydrolase domain 6 and 12 enzymes being responsible for its breakdown. Now, here's the really interesting stuff. Within the nervous system, endocannabinoids are currently believed to be synthesized on demand from stimuli such as a response to injury, ischemia, or stress. And it's done in an activity-dependent manner. So according to current literature, they're not stored in vesicles like most of our neurotransmitters. So this is achieved by the catabolism of phospholipid membrane components located within the postsynaptic neuron. So once manufactured, you can see here the endocannabinoids, mainly 2-AG, travel back across the synaptic cleft, binding to the cannabinoid receptors on the presynaptic neuron, inhibiting the various inhibitory or excitatory neurotransmitters. This action is known as retrograde synaptic flow and is the primary activity noted by Raphael Mechoulam of the endocannabinoids. Now, due to the anatomical distribution of the endocannabinoid system throughout the brain, spinal cord, enteric, and peripheral nervous systems, it plays a pivotal role in regulating a broad list of physiological homeostatic processes, including the regulation of stress and emotions, digestion, pain, cardiovascular and respiratory function, immune function, neural development, synaptic plasticity and learning, memory, movement, metabolism and energy expenditure, balance, inflammation, appetite regulation, sleep-wake cycles, thermogenesis, and psychomotor behavior. You know, all kind of stuff we really need. So this is why this understanding of the endocannabinoid system is so important, because it is a far-reaching modulatory system. So with its ubiquitous distribution throughout the central and peripheral nervous systems, the ECS plays a meaningful role in the various neurological pathophysiology, such as epilepsy. Early studies have demonstrated defects within the endocannabinoid system in epilepsy patients, with one study on patients with newly diagnosed temporal lobe epilepsy exhibiting significantly lower levels of anandamide in their cerebrospinal fluid than in contrast to healthy controls. Further supporting the hypothesis that the ECS may play a role in seizure inhibition in epilepsy was a study on resected tissue following surgery for epilepsy, whereby epilepsy patients demonstrated lower levels of CB1 receptor mRNA expression in the glutamatergic terminals of the dentate gyrus, in contrast to postmortem controls from non-epileptic subjects. Interestingly, reduced expression of DAGL-alpha was also found in epilepsy patients, which is, I'm sure you will remember, the enzyme responsible for 2-AG synthesis postsynaptically. So here we can see inherent dysfunction. Reduced levels of AEA or anandamide have also been identified in the cerebrospinal fluid of patients with chronic migraine, with subsequent studies showing the gene encoding for the CB1 receptor, the CNR1, being linked to a chromosomal region identified with migraine and variations in CNR1 gene expression showing predisposition to higher risk of migraine development. Not surprisingly, a clinical endocannabinoid deficiency has been posited by Russo as being potentially critical in our understanding of the pathophysiology behind migraine and numerous other functional conditions such as irritable bowel syndrome and fibromyalgia. But it's not all about deficiency. Excess levels of endocannabinoids have also been noted in the literature. Point 2 here is of interest. So, as previously, this was largely believed to be the domain of endorphins. Producing our own endocannabinoids as a response to exercise gives new meaning to the term runner's high and also changes our previous chemical understanding of reward-seeking behaviors. Increased levels of anandamide have been found in both the plasma and CSF of schizophrenic patients, in contrast to healthy controls. Furthermore, single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, have also been described for the CNR2 gene, which codes for the CB2 receptor, with researchers suggesting that susceptibility for schizophrenia may be increased by a genetically predetermined decrease in the functioning of the CB2 receptor. Let's now move on to the cardiovascular system, as the ECS can play an important role here too, both in physiology and the development and progression of common CVS disorders. So studies have shown that in cases of heart failure, that endocannabinoids are produced by activated monocytes, which in turn contribute to the development of hypotension, low blood pressure that is, and negative inotropic activity, so decreased force of contraction. Further research demonstrated that under pathophysiological conditions, cardiac myocytes and vascular smooth muscle cells can also generate endocannabinoids, which can then interact with CB1 receptors and could cause reactive oxygen species and advanced glycation end product accumulation, which can contribute to the cell death and injury of the tissue. Of interest here is that upregulation of the CB1 receptors and an increase in endocannabinoid expression were noted in the myocardium in these experimental models. A 2012 study by Rajesh and colleagues suggested that the CB1 receptor promotes cardiac dysfunction, oxidative stress, inflammation, and fibrosis in diabetic cardiomyopathy. Conversely, the CB2 receptor involvement in the cardiovascular system appears to be protective, with activation decreasing pro-inflammatory and fibrotic responses and initiating protective effects in cardiac myocytes. CB2 activation reduces immune cell chemotaxis, inflammatory cell adhesion, and cellular activation, which appears to be behind the protective effects in preclinical models of myocardial infarction, that's a heart attack, stroke, restenosis, and atherosclerosis. So whilst a great deal more research into the influence of the endocannabinoid system over cardiovascular system function and pathophysiology is required, it's clear that ECS dysfunction is present, particularly with CB1 overactivity in various cardiovascular diseases, and that CB1 antagonists and CB2 agonists are of great clinical interest in pharmacotherapy for specific cardiovascular disorders and conditions in the future. So what about the immune system? A growing research base is showing that anandamide may indeed inhibit immune function by reducing the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, whereas 2-AG, acting through the CB2 receptor, may inhibit the migratory activities of certain immune cells by modulating various pathways. So of particular interest is that studies have shown anandamide reduce things like interleukin-6, interleukin-8, and from human monocytes, and also suppresses the release of interleukin-2, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and interferon gamma from activated T lymphocytes, the latter via a CB2-mediated receptor. So this is perhaps why many autoimmune and neurodegenerative patients are utilizing cannabis and finding relief. And now a snapshot of ECS physiology for the gastrointestinal system. So most endocannabinoid activity in the GIT is mediated by the CB1 receptor under normal physiological conditions, with mesenteric vasodilation and acid suppression, motility stimulation, and fluid secretion being common examples. Homeostatic mechanisms involving the GIT are listed on this slide for you, and this is just what we currently know. Now, with a growing research base demonstrating the connection between a balanced intestinal microbiota and normal immune function, GIT and neurological functioning, it may not surprise many in the audience to hear that CB1 expression on enterocytes is actually regulated by your own enteric microbiota, with CB1 activation increasing epithelial permeability by reduced expression of tight gap junctions, permitting bacterial translocation through the wall and potential metabolic endotoxemia and leaky gut type scenarios. So blocking CB1 expression, therefore, may help normalize this intestinal barrier dysfunction, and also has been investigated for reducing obesity over in France. So conversely, CB2 activation within the GIT can exert the normalizing effect in instances of increased gastric motility observed in specific GIT conditions. Now, still in the GIT, the liver also has a rather sparse population of cannabinoid receptors, but CB1 receptors are found in hepatocytes, vascular endothelial cells, and the stellate cells, whereas CB2 are predominantly expressed in the immune cells within the liver, such as the Kupffer cells. Bless you. Research suggests that CB1 activation has been associated with vasodilation, leading to ascites, increase in fat deposition, and insulin resistance and fibrosis. In contrast to this, of course, not surprisingly, CB2 exerts anti-inflammatory activity, reducing cytokine production and having an opposing effect to the CB1 activation. And this may be a very interesting new line of research into conditions affecting the liver, such as cirrhosis and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Now, key to understanding the endocannabinoid system is that every individual will express this differently and with slight variability. So certain individuals may express an abundance of receptors but not produce many of their own endocannabinoids, what we would term an endocannabinoid deficiency. Conversely, others may exhibit the opposite presentation, but variability in the development and expression of the ECS, whether it's receptor numbers and expression in tissues, endocannabinoid concentrations, or the enzyme amounts, significantly impact this resting tone of the ECS, which is therefore impacts the homeostatic regulatory mechanism. It may also potentially modify, and this is more important, how phytocannabinoids, that is the cannabinoids produced from plants, or synthetic cannabinoids, those derived synthetically from a laboratory, may interact with the individual. Now, whilst cannabis is certainly not the panacea that many claim it to be, and it may not work for everybody, as we start to unfold the mysteries of the endocannabinoid system and its influence over disease and homeostasis, I expect that we will see this amazing plant medicine take its rightful place back in the pharmacopoeial armamentarium once more, and it be utilized in a far more patient-centric and personalized manner. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is your whirlwind tour in the endocannabinoid system for today. So, thank you. So just finishing up, as Australian politicians and medical practitioners and police struggle with the changes needed to reintroduce this plant-based medicine into our current regulatory frameworks, it would be prudent to remember the wise words of a Roman consul, politician, and lawyer, Cicero, who, and I apologize for my Latin, but salus populi suprema lex esto, which roughly translates as, let the welfare of the people be the supreme law. Thank you for your kind attention.